is Josie Kim, and I'm the host of the Global View podcast. Welcome to episode 4, where we'll be examining efforts that have promoted Asian American empowerment with an interview with an executive director from the AAPI Victory Alliance. Can you please introduce yourself and feel free to include information about your position and background?
Yeah. So my name is Varun Nikore, and I'm executive director of the AAPI Victory Alliance. We're a national political and nonprofit organization that focuses on empowering the API community all over the country. But in particular, we're focused on several issues, which I know we'll delve into that essentially are a little bit more motivational and allow for encouraging more participation of the API community around the country.
So, what legislative actions regionally or even nationally have been taken to promote AAPI empowerment? And more specifically, what are some of the top policies that the AAPI Victory Alliance have helped advance?
Yeah, there are many, and I would maybe quantify that by saying that just the last several years in our country, obviously, Asian Americans have faced a lot of adversity when it comes to hate that we've seen pop up during the middle of the pandemic and that we're frankly still feeling around the country. And so there's been several measures, several pieces of legislation that particularly address hate crimes against APIs and kind of a little bit more of an expanded definition of what hate looks like. And then one of the effects of this long tail of hate driven up by the vicious rhetoric of the last administration has really been that many APIs are feeling scared and essentially trying to protect their families. And so we've seen, for example, a rise in gun ownership, which is quite alarming because by many accounts, frankly, all accounts, folks are not safer when they purchase guns. And so it's been a central issue, a core issue amongst the API Victory Alliance to try to address not only gun ownership, but gun safety, sort of the root causes of what's driving all of this, so that we can, at a holistic level, try to address what we can do, to essentially minimize impacts of guns. And frankly, right now, suicides in our community are unfortunately and alarmingly rising to really high levels. So there's a bunch of things in there that we're trying to address and get down to.
So, is there any legislation that has hindered the Asian American empowerment movement, either current or historically?
That's a great question. And one I think that at a very high level we're trying to wrap our head around. And I perhaps this wasn't sort of maybe why you asked the question, but it's something that we're thinking about internally about addressing it, which is essentially with the advent of artificial intelligence and the greater use in the last year and a half or so, we believe that we can use AI to at least evaluate, for example, the last decade of legislation that's come out of Congress, that's come out of state capitals around the country, to see where disparities existed in the legislation, where it didn't take care and serve API communities, and then produce a document that will allow us to either rectify some pieces of legislation that were passed in the past, but also uh, perhaps give us ideas about future legislation that we could propose. For example, in the areas of data disaggregation, in the areas of language access, in the areas of ensuring that when government monies are doled out for things like healthcare or business services, small business, et cetera, that it's reaching all pockets of the very non-monolithic and very wide API community.
So, how much of an impact have social movements like Stop Asian Hate had on the Asian community?
Yeah, it's had an amazing impact, and the folks at Asian Hate are really doing stellar work. And unfortunately, they're going to be busy for quite some time. And so, and how I guess it's affected social movements, it's made it much more, frankly, acceptable to be not only civically engaged, but also politically active. One of the great things that we saw turning lemons into lemonade, if you will, in the 2020 election was record levels of participation politically all around the country for that specific election. In 2020, for example, we saw the largest increase in voting by our community than we've ever experienced in our history in this country, which was a 47% increase from the 2016 election. And so that not only has never happened in the API community, it's never happened in the history of this country where any one demographic group increased their voting by that large of a percentage in such a short period of time. And so I think as we have our election around the corner in about 90 days or so, one wonders, can we continue to ramp up our voting in this upcoming election? And I think, we really can, because even with that large rise in 2020, that 47% increase, we still undervoted by 5% less than the national average. And so not only can we get to the national average, I believe, in this election, but we can exceed participation. I think there's a lot of APIs that, for example, are very engaged and fired up about the fact that Kamala Harris is at the top of the ticket. They see a fellow Asian, a fellow AAPI, who also has a very similar immigrant story to our stories, our collective stories. And since APIs in this country are 63% are first generation immigrant, they see that sort of common background, and I think it really motivates them to want to get involved.
So, how does the AAPI Victory Alliance build relationships with other organizations, and what are some initiatives or projects you've progressed with them?
Yeah. So it by virtue of our name, Alliance, we really look at that as our core central tenet of how we get things done. Two of the areas that we focus on, specifically issue areas, are in climate and gun violence. And so in gun violence, we work with a whole host of other API groups to make sure that we're centering our work around gathering input and making sure that no corner of the gun violence problem is left uncommunicated and untouched. It touches each of our communities slightly differently than others. And so that's why those disparate voices are so very important to us. And I would say also the same in the areas of climate change. We work not only with API groups, we also work with mainstream climate groups to ensure that we're getting the best input, the best access to policy so that we can maybe tailor it specifically to API communities. But once again, we view it as our central role to ensure that we're gathering all those voices that we can, because we very much believe that that produces the best possible outcome at the end of the day when you've got not only a wide area of views, but you also have that consensus that will help ensure that your chances of success are much greater.
So, what is the biggest obstacle to achieving success in the AAPI empowerment movement?
I would say it's twofold. One might be lack of resources. And so the Asians in Philanthropy organization do studies every year. And unfortunately, we are probably one of the most underinvested in groups philanthropically, politically, and so we really need to close that gap. We're roughly 7% of the population in the country, and we are less than 0.3% of all philanthropic dollars that get invested into AAPI organizations in this country. So there is that magnitude of disparity that exists. And the gap perhaps is closing a little bit, but it needs to be done in exponential ways rather than incremental ways, because at some point there's going to be a rift, there's going to be some effects of that lack of investment. And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that many in this country still don't understand who APIs are, obviously that we're a non-monolithic community. We have various immigrant experiences. Some have come as technology workers. Some have come as refugees. Some are escaping famine and economic insecurity. And so it's very disparate. And but I have a lot of optimism, frankly, because I think one of the biggest positive changes, frankly, that positive effects of our community have been in the area of that a lot of people really enjoy our food. And so can we use, food as that bridge for better understanding? And I see it play out every day on my social media feeds. And so I think that can be a proponent, an accelerant of that education and understanding that I was just referring to.
So, how has the view of Asian Americans developed over the last 10 to 15 years, and what, if any, issues arise with this?
Yeah, we've seen, for example, a lot of changes in what are core issue areas of interest and concern amongst Asian Americans. And so, for the better part of maybe 2 decades or so, up until really the last, say, 4 years, 5 years or so, we saw traditionally what APIs mainly cared about were immigration, education, economic security. Um, and unfortunately, largely due to that vicious rhetoric that we saw in the last administration during the Trump years, we saw that, mm, for example, we are still care about those three issues that I mentioned. Uh, However, other things have sort of driven to the top. And I would say, namely, at the very top, according to several surveys, gun violence all of a sudden is now amongst the top issues. And that didn't even poll, for example, in the top 10 prior to 4 or 5 years ago. And so not only are we seeing gun violence and mass shootings play out every single day in modern society, but where I think we really saw the numbers start to change and move was after the Uvalde shooting, because it was in a school, because it was with elementary school students. And I think it was sort of the combination of hate and violence that we were either experiencing or feeling that I would say intersected with our traditional reverence for education in this country. It was sort of that nexus moment where everything came together that essentially caused gun violence to rise to the very top of our concerns. And we've been working on gun violence for close to 5 years now as an organization. And it was about a year, a little bit more than a year prior to the Atlanta spa shootings, when we saw that act of violence against largely Asian females really started us on this new trajectory of concern. And so um, that I would say was probably the biggest change that we've seen in decades, is that rising concern of gun violence. And yes, other issues are important. We still care about education and immigration and climate. But I think, one other reason a lot of this changed too is that we saw some age demographic shifts in our country. And for example, probably the biggest change that we saw was that youth in this country are now the largest voting bloc. And that change happened about 2 or 3 years ago. And so we're seeing baby boomers essentially what we call age out of the system, the voting system, but we've seen now this really large voting block of youth, and their concerns are now rising to the top. They've traditionally been concerned about climate. They've been traditionally concerned about guns. And now that they're in the sweet spot of the age demographic, you're going to see politicians have to react to that in much more forceful, measured, uh, specific ways than we've ever had before.
Perfect. So those are all the questions I have prepared, but do you have any concluding statements that you want to end with?
I would just say that, this election, I think, is really going to solidify our power as APIs in this country. If we can show that we've risen to the occasion, that we're a very engaged, informed electorate, I believe that we will be the next voting bloc in this country after the Black community and the Latino community. And I believe that we will rise to that occasion, and also that we need to still exert our power, but we're getting there. We're learning as we're getting politically active, and that gives me a lot of hope, a lot of optimism in this country that we can exercise our power and ensure that we all have a seat at the table when laws are made and when decisions are made. And so that really, really gives me a lot of hope.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you so much for coming as well.
My pleasure, Josie. Thank you so much for having me, and wish you the best of luck.
Bye. Have an amazing day. Thank you for listening to the Global View podcast. Tune in next week for another episode.